In Essential Task 911, we are going to describe treatment techniques used in what's called behavior or behavioral therapy. These techniques are unique and differ considerably from what we talked about the other day. These techniques are particularly useful when treating things like anxiety disorders, such as phobias, because they're not that traditional therapist, patient on the couch dialogue back and forth. Very much the opposite. These are very active, quite unique therapy techniques. We're going to be talking about everything under behavioral. There are 4 tiers here. If that's something that you have difficulty fitting, there are a few different ways you could do this. You could use 2 pieces of paper to perhaps break up the classical conditioning techniques from the operant conditioning techniques. But this is the entirety of the essential task here. I'll go back to the task text, as we always do, and allow you to copy down the portion in yellow before proceeding into the concept map. The term behavioral is another of the color-coded columns in front of the class. It is the orange color-coded column. The term behavioral, whether it's in the context of behavioral therapy or behaviorism, pertains to all of the subject matter related to learning back in that previous unit, where we talked about the classical conditioning flowchart, Pavlov's dogs, baby Albert. We talked about operant conditioning, which was Skinner and the Skinner box. And then we talked about observational learning with the Bobo Bandura information. Behavioral therapy is the idea of taking all of those principles from that unit and then applying them to disorder treatment. Because, at least according to those that practice behavioral therapy, if you learned to be anxious around clowns, for example, well, we can simply apply the same principles of learning from that prior unit and reverse that. We can teach you so that you can learn not to feel anxious or to totally eliminate that target behavior. We're basically going to apply all of the principles from that previous unit as a therapeutic approach. This type of therapy is really useful when there's a singular target behavior that if we were to eliminate or reduce would alleviate symptoms. Like, for example, if we're treating binge eating disorder, if we can eliminate the binge eating, that might alleviate virtually all of the symptoms. If a patient is dealing with substance abuse disorder, which is not one we talked about in the concept maps, but it really is what it sounds like. Well, if we can eliminate the use of that substance, that would probably alleviate the symptoms. We're going to divide this into 2 categories. The classical conditioning flowchart, of which there are quite a few different techniques that fall into this. And then there is one technique that uses operant conditioning, which is a reward punishment-based system. We'll start on the left with classical conditioning techniques. What we're about to talk about are examples of what's called counter conditioning, which is using the classical conditioning flowchart. The US equals the UR, NS equals no response, and so on and so forth, that was used to explain why Pavlov's dogs drooled to the sound of a bell. Baby Albert immediately got afraid of animals in the aftermath of his conditioning. Use that classical conditioning flowchart to create a new response that is more desirable. So, for example, if a patient automatically exhibits anxiety in the presence of clowns or pickles, through counter conditioning, we can reteach a new response that hopefully is the complete opposite. Relaxation in the presence of clowns or pickles. That's the underlying premise of counter conditioning. Let's use that classical conditioning approach in a manner that is productive in the treatment of some of these specific disorders. There are 2 types of counter conditioning: exposure and aversion. We're going to start on the left with exposure therapy, of which there are 2. Exposure therapy is very simply the idea of exposing the patient to what it is that they normally avoid. So, for example, if you were afraid of pickles, and this might sound dramatic, it's a reference back to that unit, but if we bring you to a pickle factory, we are exposing you to pickles. That might seem really cruel, but if we are trying to treat a pickle phobia, that might actually be a reasonable approach. That idea of exposing a patient to what it is that they avoid as a means of overcoming that fear is what we call exposure therapy. In a modern context, I like to point out we actually can do this virtually now. There are headsets, virtual reality headsets that you could wear, and when you turn it on, it could cover you in spiders. Of course, that wouldn't be what's happening in reality, but virtually that could work. And as a means of alleviating, let's say, a phobia of spiders, that could actually be pretty effective. We use exposure therapy to treat fear-based anxiety disorders. So it can be phobias, but also OCD, particularly when OCD might, for example, be as a byproduct of fearing that germs are everywhere. Maybe if we could expose you to situations where there's definitely a lot of germs, that might help alleviate some of those symptoms. So if it's a fear-based or anxiety-based disorder or something that's related like OCD, exposure therapy is really, really effective. Not as much mood disorders, definitely not something like schizophrenia per se. It depends on the case, but typically no. This isn't really going to alleviate hallucinations. Definitely not some of those other disorders that we talked about. But anxiety disorders, related disorders, absolutely. There are two types that fall into exposure: flooding and systematic desensitization. Let's talk about systematic desensitization first. When we get to the bottom, I would like you to watch the entirety of this clip. It does a really good job breaking this down. Systematic desensitization is a concept created by Joseph Wolpe. We'll give him a small letter C. I haven't seen his name on the AP exam all that frequently. But it's a very basic but very methodical way of treating particularly phobias, though it can also be used depending on the patient with some forms of OCD. But this is the number one way of treating phobias. That's a very common question on the AP exam. The go-to way of treating phobias, systematic desensitization. And it's really a three-step process. One, you and your therapist need to master a relaxation technique. So typically a meditation or a breathing technique that can reliably relax you when it's necessary. Then what we do is we expose you, right? This is under exposure therapy. We expose you to your fear, but we start very small. Let's say, for example, you have a legitimate phobia of spiders. The first exposure to a spider might just simply be looking at a cartoon of a spider. For someone with a legitimate phobia, that might actually still trigger a reasonable amount of anxiety. So we expose you to a picture of a spider. Your anxiety goes up, right? You have a phobia of spiders. The anxiety occurs. Well, when you experience that anxiety, let's apply a breathing technique. Let's apply a relaxation technique. Well, when you do that, the anxiety is going to go away. Then we're going to gradually, incrementally build up. Now that you have seen a picture of a cartoon spider, let me show you a picture of a real spider. What's that going to do? It's going to shoot your anxiety up, but then we're going to apply a relaxation technique and bring it back down to a nice equilibrium. Trigger that parasympathetic nervous system to relax you back down to equilibrium. And if we do that, we can incrementally build up looking at a cartoon spider, looking at a real spider, walking into a room where you know there's a spider in a cage on the other side, getting 15 feet away from the cage, getting 5 feet away from the cage, getting a foot away from the cage, opening the roof of the cage, eventually touching and then holding the spider, and incrementally, slowly but surely, relaxing and exposing, relaxing and exposing, relaxing and exposing. And once we do this, if at each point the patient is relaxed prior to the additional exposure, we might actually get to the point of encountering your fear to the maximum degree. Because the real key here is, if at any of these points, a patient with the phobia of a spider just interacted in the manner, getting close to a spider or seeing a spider, they would feel really anxious. It would shoot their anxiety through the roof. But because they're doing these relaxations at every increment, they're starting at a nice equilibrium point. So they're going from relaxed, ultimately to touching or holding a spider. And this is by far the most effective and most common way of treating phobias. And you can apply this pyramid structure, this hierarchy here, to virtually any phobia. And that's what you really would do. You and your therapist would develop this hierarchy, denoting each of the tier levels leading up to the ultimate exposure at the top. And then you would do that simply: relax, expose, until you ultimately reach the top. The other end of exposure therapy is to do kind of the opposite. Let's just flood you. Let's just give you the maximum amount of whatever it is that you're afraid of. Like, let's bring you to the pickle factory if you have a phobia of pickles. At the end of the day, you have a phobia of pickles and you go to a pickle factory. Yes, your anxiety is going to go through the roof. Eventually, it's going to go away. And then, maybe for the first time in your entire life, or at least in the most recent part of your life, you will be surrounded by pickles and calm. You will have survived this massive exposure of pickles. And for some people, that can help them overcome their phobias. Because next thing you know, they're starting to associate the fact that, wow, I've actually calmed down. My anxiety's gone away. And I am surrounded by pickles or spiders or dogs, whatever it happens to be. It might seem cruel. Why would you have somebody with a phobia of dogs go to a dog kennel? That doesn't seem effective, but it actually can be, because by and large, the person will survive that exposure, eventually calm down. The sympathetic nervous system will be reversed by parasympathetic nervous system. It'll bring you down to an equilibrium. And then once you're there, you're calm, you're surrounded by your fear. That might be enough, because now you're associating that relaxed state with your fear, and maybe that can reverse the effects of the classical conditioning, which probably happened in the first place to first install this fear. Zooming back out, there is one more form of counter conditioning, and it's called aversion therapy or avoidance therapy. I would write both of these names. You can commonly see this referred to in either way. Aversion therapy or avoidance therapy is the idea of using the classical conditioning flowchart to identify a target behavior that we'd like to eliminate, let's say drinking too much or binge eating, and on purpose associating that unwanted behavior with an unpleasant state. So let's say, for example, there's a drug that when you take makes you sick, makes you throw up every single time. That would be the unconditioned stimulus and the unconditioned response because it's automatic. You do not have to learn it. It's natural. It's biological. If you take this drug, it's going to make you sick. Never have to learn it. Then let's take something in your life that we'd like to eliminate. Let's say it's drinking. Drinking itself doesn't necessarily cause no response, but for the flowchart, let's assume that it just says no response. Well, then let's take that alcohol that we want to eliminate and let's spike it with a drug that we know will make you sick. Well, what's going to happen when you drink that beverage? It's going to make you sick. The drug is present. The wine is present. Because the drug is present, it's going to make you sick. Hopefully what that does is the next time you think about going and buying alcohol or the next time you even look at alcohol, you feel a little nauseous. Well, that would be a good thing then. If we wanted to eliminate the behavior of drinking, if when you look at an alcoholic beverage, you feel nauseous, you're probably not going to drink it. And then therefore you will hopefully see a reduction in your drinking behavior. This obviously doesn't work for everyone. If you go to a bar, they're not putting drugs in your drinks to make it sick. If you go home and you buy a drink, same deal. The drinks you get at the alcohol store are not going to have drugs in it that make you sick. So there's that underlying dynamic where once you exit the facility, the treatment center, you're not going to be getting drinks that make you sick. But for some people, it's an automatic response. Maybe not 100%, not even nearly. Honestly, not even 50%. But for some people, it does see a reduction in their drinking. They do see a reduction in drinking overall, where they look at an alcoholic beverage and they do feel a little nauseous. And that sometimes is all that you need for a patient to no longer drink to the extent in which you're trying to eliminate. You could apply this also to binge eating. Instead of the drink, you could put French fries or burgers or unhealthy food. Intentionally make it such that when you eat a hamburger, you feel sick because at the lab you ate a hamburger that intentionally made you sick. And now the next time you look at a hamburger, you feel nauseous. We talked about when we first went into classical conditioning how many people get sick eating foods or drinking things that they really like. And the next thing you know, they avoid it. Well, let's harness that phenomenon into a productive manner. Reduce things like alcohol consumption or binge eating disorder, even could be such things as smoking cigarettes, any type of behavioral pattern or disorder in which there is a specific undesirable behavior. Let's try and use this aversion therapy technique to eliminate or at least reduce. The last, all the way to the right, is under the operant conditioning techniques portion of the concept map. It is the last box furthest to the right. Friendly reminder, it's been a little while. Operant conditioning is a term that we use to reference to the Skinner theory, the Skinner box, and the basic premise that if I reinforce you or I give you a reward, whatever it is that I reinforced will continue. Let's say I gave you a piece of candy for participating in class, you'll do it more. And then if I punish you, whatever that behavior is will happen less. If we harness those ideas into therapy, it gives us what's called token economies. Token economies is this basic idea where every time a patient does a specific target behavior, we can reward them with a token. Sometimes that can be a sticker, sometimes that can be a little poker chip, but the idea is that the patient lives in an environment. This can sometimes be in a psychiatric hospital or a long-term care facility where those individual tokens actually have value to the patient. Like, for example, the tokens could be exchanged for television privileges or extra candy or extra food at dinner or whatever it happens to be. And that behavior that is considered desirable is done frequently because those patients constantly want to acquire as many tokens as possible. For example, let's say we would like a patient in this long-term care facility to speak to strangers more often. At the bare minimum, greet others. Now when that patient greets strangers in the facility, the nursing staff provides that patient with tokens. And now at the end of the day, that patient may have acquired 10 tokens and now they get to watch TV for an extra hour. Well, that patient has been incentivized to carry out a target behavior because they're being reinforced through a reward of tokens for that specific behavior. This might work, for example, with things like social anxiety disorder. Let's say you feel anxious talking to strangers and you'd like that behavior to change. So what we might do is say, okay, introduce yourself to 10 strangers on the street today. For each of those introductions, we'll give you a token. At the end of it, you can exchange those tokens for a treat, piece of candy or something. The incentive of the candy through the tokens could allow you to then incrementally start to introduce yourself to others, building up those tokens, and then ultimately gaining some type of reward.